Hello and welcome to the coverage of the History of AF series. This is the first part in a planned multi-video adventure wherein I recount a condensed summary of major events in the fictional mythos of the world of AF, my personal world-building project of over 10 years. Many aspects of this project have been evolving dynamically, which means that the timeline has progressed and the history advanced as often as I've decided to create new plot threads and developments within the mythos. Over 10 years, the histories of AF and its many people have expanded to cover many continents, cultures, and conflicts. However, before we get into all of that, as this is the first video in the series, it is only right to start at the very beginning of AF's long and winding tale, with the sparking of Alunus, the Great Flame. Before AF, before any light stood out amidst the darkness, there was naught but the hungry, all-consuming void, the endless churning black sea. Suddenly, Alunus, the Great Flame, sparked amidst the darkness. A luminant beacon, creating a pocket of creation in the dark ocean. And in this new region of light and creation, Alunus placed AF. This very act severed the ethereal plane from the physical, and AF became the region of confluence between these two realms, two halves of the new and greater domain of existence. Binding his fate to AF, Alunus would also create many powerful divine spirits in his likeness to help him bring the influences of the ethereal into this new physical space. Firstly, Alunus created 3 spirits bound directly to AF as he was, spirits named Hasson, Aeon, and Ephon, the spirits of stone, sky, and sea. For 10,000 years, Hasson, Ephon, and Aeon waged a slow war against one another, competing for their influences over AF, with the most intense war being between Hasson and Ephon, the war between the land and ocean. Ephon would eventually create Alon, the spirit of worldly flame, in the direct image of Alunus, using him to create molten rock that he could use to create new land from the sea itself. As this war of the elements raged, Alunus would then create 3 life spirits to populate his world with unique life. Named Lunan, Linan, and Lanan, they created living nature, mighty beasts, and mankind, respectively. With the coming of life, Ephon, Aeon, and Hasson would be bid by Alunus to cease their fighting. Lunan's nature would be watched over by several children spirits that would guide and nurture the living natural forces on AF. They are therefore tied to the ethereal. His life is the first on AF, and it would exist peacefully for thousands of years. Linen's beasts are beings almost purely of the physical, and so Linen himself remains the strongest of the 3 life spirits, having tied the least of his personal power to his creations. They arrive second to AF. Lastly, Lanen's men are each gifted with a portion of his personal essence they pass down to their kin, linking them directly with the ethereal plane through their souls, while still existing primarily in the physical. For the first many ages of life, beasts ruled the surface of AF, with the more docile, lesser beasts being the prey and food source of the more powerful ancient beasts, creating an ever-growing ecosystem of both beasts and nature that existed in a brutal but stable and sustained harmony. Lunan, Linen, Hasson, Aeon, and Ephon even collaborated to create various forms of unique life that populated and spread throughout the planet in these earliest days of life. They interacted, experimented, and evolved the ecosystem of their creations on the mainland, while Lanan isolated himself, working to perfect mankind's design for hundreds of years. Finally, humans were introduced to the mainland, but they were forced to reside in caves around the primordial valley to survive from the dominant ancient predator beasts. Eventually, however, these first men began to form communities and cultures. So ended the pre-ages, the time before the rise of men. At the dawn of the first age of man, the first legendary hero of mankind was born, or rather created, by Lannan. Known as Sentinus, Zenshinu, Senechas, and many other names, he was handcrafted by Lannan and gifted with the strongest and purest soul of mankind, meant to be their perfectly ideal ruler. Through his leadership, mankind would overcome ancient beasts' dominance on Af by unifying the cavern-dwelling tribes of the Primordial Valley, with Sentinus showing them how to create fire, tools, and weapons. Each of the cultures that had formed in the Primordial Valley elected a hunter chief to represent them, but all chiefs bowed to Sentinus. After many beasts had been driven away from a region near an inlet to the Great Endless River, Sentinus enshrined Alunus and Lannan there, building a great monument to them at what would mark the first major city of mankind, Azor. Azor would become the center of the first true realm of a united mankind, Unitine, also known as the Azorine Empire, as humans from all corners of the Primordial Valley sailed down the many branches of the Endless River to find shelter within its walls. Azor itself would become a holy city of reverence and pilgrimage, its monuments to Alunus eventually growing into a sprawling temple complex and a devoted priestly class led by Sentinus himself. Alunus would appreciate this devotion and would bestow many divine gifts on mankind, who would use these gifts to further their influence to soon cover most of Af, driving away many of the ancient beasts from the Primordial Valley. Some members of the original cultures of the Primordial Valley, not content to simply be vassals to the ever-expanding Unitine, would venture beyond the frontiers of the Empire to found independent freeholds and city-states. These freeholds would still maintain regular trade and contact with Central Unitine, and most saw themselves as allies, but they would all strive to develop their own identities that honored their traditions from before even the time of Sentinus. The other divine spirits would gradually grow spiteful of mankind's success, however, and of the devastation it had caused the life they had created on Af. Lunan, Linan, Aeon, Hafon, Ephon, and Alon would begin to collaborate to create the great Father Wyverns, mighty creatures infused with the base ethereal elements. There was the first, Vorgorian, the grandfather worm, the sea tyrant, but his intended hatred for mankind had accidentally become supplanted with a proclivity for isolation and reverence from the humans instead. After the failure of Vorgorian, however, there were 5 successful Father Wyverns created that would lead the assault to stunt mankind's growth. There was Molten Crag of the Worldly Flame, Isilith of the Bitter Winter, Eomust of the Howling Winds, Gorgorond of the Shifting Earth, and Ixandes of the Hungry Void. Some of the freeholds, such as the Lunari and Zigrati, who were sympathetic to the spirit's plight and believed that mankind's influence on Af had to be tempered to maintain balance, would even side with these spirits and begin mustering forces to wage a great war against Unitine, fighting alongside the Father Wyvern. These rogue freeholds would be aided by the spirits as well, and soon were utilizing titanic elemental golems, enhancements on their mortal forms, and all manner of other blessings to combat the Azorine. Sentinus would raise a mighty army to combat these rogue freeholds, and create an elite order of holy warriors known as the Dragoons to combat the new threat of the titanic golems, the wyverns, and their spawn. Together, Sentinus and the Dragoons succeeded in killing 2 of the original 5 Father Wyverns, Isilith and Gorgorond, while the army of Unitine fended off the Freehold's attacks on the frontiers. But one of the Wyverns, Ixandes, had become far too powerful due to his connection to the hungry maw of the void, allowing him to consume ethereal energy as the crusade against mankind continued. Eventually, Ixandes would become powerful and bold enough from his incessant hunger to kill Linan himself, one of the divine spirits that had created him, and the mightiest of the life spirits. This shocking act allowed Ixandes to steal Linan's divine power for his own, using it to quickly topple nearly all of mankind's progress, and in turn growing powerful enough to perhaps challenge even Alunus himself for dominion over all Af. The remaining divine spirits would all flee, knowing that Ixandes had surpassed any of them in strength, and that if any of them should fall, Ixandes would surely become too great a threat for even Alunus. At this dark hour, Ixandes had complete domination over all of Af, even killing Senthinus himself, despite the warrior king's heroic last stand at the mountain of Hierophel. Soon, tens of thousands of men were being sacrificed each day to Ixandes in an attempt to bolster his power against his impending battle with Alunus. Even the freeholds who had supported the Wyverns now openly opposed Ixandes, however, and only the most fervent cultists of the Wyvern god enforced these sacrifices. Alunus could no longer sit idly by and allow for this horrific, genocidal barbarity to continue. He would descend to Af to do battle with the tyrannical Black God. Ixandes and Alunus would clash in an apocalyptic battle that would shake both physical and ethereal halves of reality to their cores. Alunus would eventually manage to prevail over his foe, but Af was nearly destroyed from the tremendous impact of their duel, something Ixandes had hoped would deter Alunus. Alunus had foreseen this fate, however, and would use his remaining strength to sacrifice himself to save Af, seeping within the cracks of the broken world and closing it shut from the inside, leaving Af a shattered form, alone in darkness, but enduring. Such was the breaking of Af. Such was the war in heaven. So was the ending of the first age of man. Thus concludes the first entry in the History of Af series, covering the pre-ages and the first age of man. Thank you so much for listening, and please, if you have any lingering curiosities regarding the timeline or of any specific details, feel free to leave any questions in the comments down below. Satisfying the curiosity of someone genuinely engaged with my work has been one of my most consistent joys as a world builder. Aside from that, feel free to subscribe and stay tuned for future entries in the series, as well as keeping an eye on my Reddit linked below for new art and writing featuring Af. To conclude this video, I will now leave you with a beautiful reading of a famous poem of the First Age in the native Azarine language, Boyalunien, also known as In Ancient Days, or the Epic of Senthinus.
Boyaluni enton boyal lenosi. Lenosios nulla lenan, o lefu o nekomie. Sentinus ganu, al naru fetorsi, eno balmurio gansa boylenosi, eno heno oso nermos carnemos. Eno usio balnu katos lenosios ol. Sentinus usie, al tras alunas al nar asorin lenosios. Hemu acta af ol oro uso. Usol atras sentinus acta alunas al naro ala acta al naru fetorsi. Oro al fortos dis. Boya lunien, lenosios giri un. Lunosi e lenosi, mones oro uso argir en. Boyosen yermos, banulu Tono bakta useos ol uso. Ton gansa, ragunsa, boya lunien. Tono oken garmo, nermenos Nisai, entos katos sentinos ol. Tona balmaro gansa yermos, kean uso busar. Tasa tises, ecos lunios. Casa one yerm, exandis. Eso oken garmo, eno casumo, ruses y eno balmurros ol. Eno basmo, uso, useos, ecos, exa, alos. Eno esu, boyexa alna uso tiol. Alunas e exandis oi neru. Eas kakos ut garmo I, eifu unfa eso pacto so salenol. Casa exandis eso palmuro. Alunas masam enos ala anis oro af. Oro acta uso ol. Benye tenu.